Hello and welcome to my channel, I Win to Lose Gaming. In today's video, I'm going to go through pretty much everything that I know about Yaoyao as a character, and we're actually going to do a full and comprehensive guide for not just one build, but two entire builds. And what are those two builds? Well, the first one is going to be what most people are going to use her for, as well as kind of what I recommend for you to use her for, which is a general support slash healer build. And the second one is actually going to be a DPS Yaoyao build. So let's just go right into it, because these type of videos take way too long in all honesty, and what better way to shorten them a bit by not rambling on like what I'm doing right now, which is to get you guys to click on that subscribe button, and let's hop right into her talents. When we look at her talents, her basic attacks are basically useless, so let's move on from those. Now, her elemental skill is pretty interesting. We can see that it throws them out. Like, they behave very similarly to Klee's mines, and they just kind of sit there, and once there's more than 5, they start exploding, well, and also timing out as well. So yeah, you can pick them up for some healing and some stuff like that. The targeting for this, the way it works is that if you are less than 100% HP and there's no enemies near you, it will target you. If you're less than 70% HP, even if there are enemies near you, it will target you to heal you. And there is a small AoE, so when it actually hits you, if you're right next to an enemy, when it heals you, it will actually hit the enemy as well. And finally, when you're over 70% HP and there's an enemy near you, then it will target that enemy instead. Now, let's move on to her elemental burst, Moonjade Descent. Moonjade Descent, 80 energy cost, 20-second cooldown, 5-second duration, increases your danger resistance, well, you know, only really for Yaoyao, because this is a burst that you actually have to be on field for. If you swap out, you lose it, but it does an initial Dendro hit, and then every single radish that's thrown out by Yaoyao, as well as her Yuegui from her elemental skill, will be converted over to the Adepto Legacy White Jade Radish damage. Her elemental burst drops 3 Yueguis, which only last for these 5 seconds, and they're staggered out as well. In total, the 3 Yueguis from her elemental burst will throw 9 radishes. Yaoyao will also throw 9 radishes because of her passive 1, where she will throw 1 jade radish from her backpack if she's dashing or jumping every 0.6 seconds. This will also heal the entire party as well. So that's pretty much all you need to know about her elemental burst. It is a good kind of pinch situation where you need to heal either Yaoyao or your entire team. Now really quick, let's go through her ICDs. From my testing, when you just toss out her elemental skill, it applies Dendro to a single target 4 times. When you toss out just her elemental burst, it somehow applies Dendro 5 times, which doesn't really line up with that 2.5 second ICD. So I'm actually not 100% sure exactly how it works, but you know, honestly, it doesn't really matter that much. Just know that she doesn't apply like a ton of Dendro, all things considered, in comparison to other Dendro characters. And finally, the Q's initial hit does apply Dendro that's independent from the radishes that she throws out. Now for Yaoyao's talent priority, I personally don't think it's too important, honestly. At least get them up to level 6, so that way you have a reasonable amount of healing on both her elemental skill and elemental burst. For DPS Yaoyao, because she's going to be focused entirely on her burst damage, just level up her elemental burst. Her elemental skill and basic attacks basically don't matter at all for a DPS Yaoyao build. Okay. I didn't want to spend too much time on her kit because you guys probably know it by now since this guide video is a little late. So next, let's actually talk about her weapon options. She really just has 4 best weapons to choose from. And the first one is the Favonius Lance. This thing is just totally a universal support weapon. It is probably arguably the best pole arm support weapon in the game. It just provides a ton of energy for the entire team as well as for Yaoyao herself. Now do keep in mind that with this weapon you want to build both crit rate and probably HP percent for more healing on Yaoyao. Now the next weapon to talk about is probably the Black Tassel. Black Tassel provides 46.9% HP. It just increases the amount that she heals. Up next is the Moon Piercer. The Moon Piercer is a weapon that drops a leaf if you trigger an elemental reaction with the Dendro related reaction with this character. Obviously Yaoyao's Dendro, she triggers that very easily, and it will drop a leaf kind of randomly randomly between 16 to 32% attack if you pick it up for 12 seconds. Honestly, I find the picking up a leaf mechanic to be very cumbersome, very clunky, and honestly not worth it. However, if it happens to just drop right in front of your next character that needs to pick it up, it is pretty convenient, and it is a decent buff of up to 32% if you use 5 polearm billets. Up next is the Katane Cross Spear. Katane Cross Spear will help you with burst uptime when you use her elemental skill. Now, this weapon will help you a lot with maintaining Yaoyao's burst uptime, but besides that, you know, I mean, how many teams do you really care about having Yaoyao's burst uptime? Up next, we have her artifact choices, with one of probably the best artifact choices for her is the Deepwood Memories. And the Deepwood Memories is going to be great for her on multiple different teams. For example, if you pair her with an Alhaitham, with an on-field Nahida, Tignari, as well as various other Dendro damage related teams like Bloom teams, Hyper Bloom teams, even Nilo teams, she can use the 4-piece Deepwood Memories. Up next is the 4-piece Tenacity of the Millilith. This is good in my opinion for primarily aggravate teams. If you want Yaoyao to be the main and perhaps only Dendro applicator for an aggravate team, this way she can support, for example, your main DPS Kaching or main DPS Sino. And after the Tenacity of the Millilith, we actually have the Instructors. The Instructor's 4-piece adds 120 Elemental Mastery for 8 seconds. Do keep in mind that you have to be on field for this artifact set. So in other words, you have to wait a little bit for her Yuegui to hit an enemy with its Radish and trigger a Dendro reaction in order to activate the Instructor's 4-piece. Now do keep in mind that with this Instructors, it's difficult to actually run a Favonius weapon because it's hard to get a lot of crit stats, especially crit rate, on your substats and artifacts because it is a 4-star artifact. You will also have significantly less healing with this, but typically, you know, Yaoyao's healing is more than enough to at least be comfortable with taking a couple hits here or there, so sacrificing the healing isn't as big of a deal, but do keep in mind that it's difficult to actually use the Favonius Lance with the Instructor set. Now, after this, in my opinion, the artifacts aren't as impactful to your team because, for example, we have the 4-piece Maidens, which will increase healing significantly. However, I find myself to not really need like Yaoyao to heal a ton more. Because Yaoyao is such a flexible character, I figured I would give you guys a few sample builds for you guys to try out. Now the first one is going to be a Favonius General Support Yaoyao. And for this one, we can see here for my stats, I have a lot of crit rate. The goal is to proc the Favonius passive as reliably as possible. And also she has a good amount of HP for a good amount of healing. Tenacity is great because it adds passive HP as well as 20% attack very reliably thanks to her elemental skill. Yuegui, which, yeah, keeps the uptime on this thing very high. Now for the main stats on this thing, I highly recommend HP % Timepiece, HP % Goblet, and Crit Rate Circlet. With a build like this, you generally don't care too much about a burst uptime because all you really care about is having Yuegui uptime for the main DPS characters to do their damage. Now the best teams that, in my opinion, this build is for Aggravate Kaching as well as Aggravate Sino. They both appreciate the energy as well as the 20% attack buff. You can also use this build with Alhaitham, although perhaps the next build might be a little bit better for Alhaitham. Speaking of the next build, this one is the max damage buff Yaoyao, where I have the Moon Pierce to provide an attack buff, as well as the Instructor's 4-piece to provide the very nice 120 elemental mastery buff. So this build is probably good on, for example, a main DPS Alhaitham spread team. It will be good for Tignari as well, or even an on-field Nahida, because this way you can provide those characters with the maximum amount of damage that you can. Now, for the stats, I recommend an HP %, Timepiece, HP % Goblet, as well as a healing bonus circlet. This way her healing will still be up to par, and this is another build where you don't really care too much about Yaoyao's elemental burst uptime. Now this next build is focused entirely on healing, and it is a great budget build to get started with Yaoyao, and especially if you feel like you need more healing, I recommend this build. The weapon is the Black Tassel, and the artifact set is the 4-piece Maiden's Beloved, or you can use a combination of the 4-piece Maidens plus the 2-piece Ocean Hue Clam. Main stats, we have HP, and healing, which will really enhance your healing significantly. So I'm probably going to be one of the few people on YouTube that will actually provide a full guide on DPS Yaoyao. Now, before we continue, here's a massive disclaimer when it comes to DPS Yaoyao. Don't build DPS Yaoyao. Now with that out of the way, if you are like me and you just want to build a DPS Yaoyao, I'm going to teach you a little bit about it first. So the first thing to note about DPS Yaoyao is how to actually use her. You want to toss out her elemental skill first, then use her elemental burst. This way, the elemental burst will convert her elemental skill radishes into elemental burst damage. And at talent level 10, she will output roughly 3,323% of raw skill multiplier. For her artifacts, we can keep it pretty simple and we can just use the emblem of severed fates on her. Now, because Yaoyao scales really hard off of the attack stat, for the artifact main stats, I do recommend an attack percent timepiece with a dendro damage goblet, and finally a crit rate or crit damage circlet. Let's dive into her weapons. If we look at this chart, we have some pretty obvious options. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but for free-to-play players, I highly recommend just the catch at Refinement 5. This weapon is obviously one of the best weapons with the emblem of severed fates. Probably the best weapon for her is the engulfing lightning. However, you know, the engulfing lightning is basically just the catch, but a little bit better in most situations. And after that, we have the Staff of Homa, which is also an incredible weapon for Yaoyao. And a sleeper pick for Yaoyao is actually the Wave Breaker's Fin. So if you do have this thing, especially at Refinement 5 in particular, this weapon will do quite a lot of damage for Yaoyao. But do keep in mind that you don't have the energy recharge substat that you have for the catch, as well as for the engulfing lightning. So you're going to have some burst uptime issues with the Wave Breaker's Fin. Let's go through Yaoyao's constellations. Yaoyao's Constellation 1 provides 15% dendro damage for a second if you are hit by one of her white jade radishes. Do keep in mind that this sometimes can not be that consistent, because if the Yaoyao targets the enemy and you're not within range of the radius, you may not get the buff. And also, if you want to use this with DPS Yaoyao, you actually have to delay your elemental burst until the first radish is thrown. That way you can get the 15% dendro damage bonus, and then you can snapshot her elemental burst with that dendro damage bonus. So do keep that in mind. Now up next is her Constellation 2, which will help a lot with Yaoyao's burst uptime. And based on this 0.8 second cooldown, I would estimate that this thing provides 12 to 18 energy for Yaoyao, which will make her 80 elemental burst cost energy much more manageable. Now, her Constellation 3 just adds 3 levels to her elemental skill. This one will just increase the amount of healing that it does, which is nice, and there's not much else to say about it. Her Constellation 4 will provide her up to 120 elemental mastery if you have 40,000 hit points. If you have 20,000 hit points, you'll gain about 60 elemental mastery. As we can see in this chart, this adds roughly 3% to Yaoyao's overall damage output. Now, her Constellation 5, on the other hand, adds 3 levels to her elemental burst, which adds about an additional 15% damage on top of her Constellation 4. And this one is nice if you have a burst DPS Yaoyao, and it will also increase the amount of healing that her burst does, which, you know, it already has plenty of healing, but you'll get more healing out of it. Finally is her Constellation 6, which I have not done enough testing for, but based on the way it's worded, I'm assuming that this isn't going to help much for a DPS burst damage focused build, because the way that it's worded implies that the elemental skill version of it throws out the giant radish, and it will probably stay as elemental skill damage, which obviously doesn't scale with the emblem of severed fates. On top of that, from the clips I've seen, the 3 additional Yaoyao that are created from her elemental burst don't actually throw out these big additional radishes. However, her elemental skill version will throw out 2 of these over the course of roughly 4 tosses. Let's talk about a few Yaoyao teams that you can use her in. Because Yaoyao's dendro application isn't like really high, she's an incredible dendro applicator for an aggravate focused team like Kaching or Sino in this spot, and this way you can slot Fischl and Sucrose, and you also fulfill a healer as well as dendro applicator in Yaoyao. This team actually feels really powerful, and it feels extraordinarily functional because now you actually have a healer and you're able to use Fischl, who is incredible on aggravate teams. Of course, Yaoyao can be paired in a spread focus team like Alhaitham or Tignari, and you can use literally any electro character here that you want. You can use sub DPSs like Fischl or Yaimiko, or I don't know, even Beto, because Beto works with Alhaitham. So as you can see, Yaoyao just really is extraordinarily flexible, and she can support main DPS Dendro characters as well. Alhaitham, you can even use on-field Nahida as well as Tignari. They will all do great with Yaoyao as a secondary Dendro to either help battery them, heal them, and apply a bit more Dendro for all intents and purposes. So I did want to talk about Yaoyao in, for example, a Hyper Bloom setup like this one. Now, unfortunately, Yaoyao's Dendro application is not really enough for Xingqiu's Water Swords, because especially if you have Xingqiu at Constellation 6, you will make way too many blooms, and then it will remove Dendro, and then Yaoyao will be the one activating the bloom, which is not ideal due to the way that Dendro and Hydro react. So Yaoyao's Dendro application is a bit too low for Hyper Bloom, so do keep that in mind. You may need a second Dendro character, like for example, any other Dendro character as well, including Yaoyao, and that will typically provide you enough Dendro to Hyper Bloom very comfortably. I did want to talk about using Yaoyao with a Nilo team. Oftentimes, you can even get away with triple Hydro with Nahida in order to just activate a ton of blooms constantly due to Nahida's insane amount of Dendro application. But with that being said, if you don't really care like too much about min-maxing your Nilo team's damage, Yaoyao is going to give you that quality of life that you will really appreciate in a Nilo team. Just do keep in mind that with Yaoyao, just like the Hyper Bloom team, in a Nilo Bloom team, you will absolutely want a second Dendro character, like for example, a Nahida, and then you can use, I don't know, another Hydro character like Yelan or Xingqiu. Okay, so that wraps up my knowledge transfer of Yaoyao to you guys. Do let me know what you think about Yaoyao and if I missed anything down in the comments below. As always, I appreciate every single one of you. This is I Win to Lose, signing out.